Next we have Dr. David Nutt, who will cover the rest of the world.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye now.
Thanks. Let me see if this works. Okay, am I in your way? You can see the screen, can you? You sure? Okay, good. So I was asked to talk about international policies for psychedelics, and I explained to the organisers actually it wouldn't take very long. So could I fill the rest of the hour telling you what we've been doing and others have been doing in terms of the brain science? So they agreed kindly. But the logo here, by the way, it shows how the field has transformed in just a few years. That logo is the logo of the Bristol University Physiology and Pharmacology Society. That's a student logo for their society. And to my mind, that's remarkable evidence that we're winning the discussion, at least, for a student society to endorse what we're doing and come up with rather clever little pictures like that. There's genes and there's neurons. I don't know what the bones have got to do with Amanita, but anyway, that's another story. So we've already, Kerry touched on this a little in his talk, but the constraints that we have to deal with today are really within these two UN conventions, the 61 Convention on Plants and Fungi and the 71 Convention, Psychotropic Convention, which covers synthetics and pure extracts of those. And these conventions have two goals. They have the goal of preventing abuse, and the second goal is ensuring their availability for medical and scientific purposes. And I guess I don't need to tell this audience that they've failed on both in a very catastrophic way. And they failed because, I think, almost intentional ignoring or having a blinkered perspective on the benefits and a collection of misrepresentations of the harms. So it's common still today for me to talk to colleagues, scientists, pharmacologists, psychiatrists who say, well, these drugs are really dangerous, aren't they? These psychedelics are dangerous because they're addictive. I say, no, they're not addictive, and they've never been addictive. Well, they must be addictive because they wouldn't be in Schedule 1, would they? They're in Schedule 1 because, essentially, because Nixon and the American government wanted them in Schedule 1, and those days, the American government controlled the United Nations, and so basically the rest of the world complied with what the UN wanted. And it's also common for people to say, well, there is no medical value, and of course, there's huge medical value, and there was an enormous amount of medical value that was known before they were made illegal, but that was conveniently forgotten. And the third thing, and this is the thing that particularly exercises me in the charity that I work with, Drug Science, that it doesn't seem as though there was any consideration ever made to the lost opportunities. So the banning of these drugs was supposedly got something to do with reducing harms, although there weren't many harms, and it's not really obvious whether any benefits accrued in that direction. But the loss of opportunities for people with medical, psychiatric, neurological problems who would have benefited from these didn't seem to be part of the discussion at all. And of course, as I'll show you, the power of the ban has been so overwhelming that it's actually kind of fueled I'm going to say a virtuous circle, but it's very much a non-virtuous circle of ignorance which perpetuates the misunderstandings. So here is the impact that the 67 ban in the States and the 71 UN conventions had on psychedelic research. So the blue lines are the number of papers per year published with LSD, and then the pink one, the red one at the bottom, is psilocybin. And you can see a massive increase in research publications, peaking around about 1967, Why was that? That was because the US government, through the National Institutes of Health, which is way the biggest funder of biomedical research in the world, funded over 140 separate grants to study these compounds. And then the arrow shows when that stopped. You can see there are a couple of years where the data was being written up, because obviously it takes 2-3 years to get all your data out, and then the precipitate fall in publications. And by the way, I can just say to all of you, if any of you want, you can have all my slides. So have them afterwards. You know, you don't have to take pictures, just take them. There was, I believe, although it's not, I don't think it was ever written, but there were conversations going on, particularly in the CIA and the DEA and NIDA. There was a hope that you could get rid of all knowledge of psychedelics. If you didn't fund any research, people would forget that there ever was any value. And it got very close. You see, in 1990 and 1991, there was not a single paper in the world published on psilocybin. That catastrophic fall-off was caused by two main factors. The first was that after that red arrow, the US government, NIH, never funded another study. That's just been rectified, as you know, last November. Matt Johnson's study of psilocybin and tobacco smoking has been funded. So we've had a 55-year hiatus in funding from the biggest funder in the world. And the second reason is that even if you could get funding from, a donor or a philanthropist, you couldn't get the drug. And the DEA in the US and in my country, the MHRA, made it virtually impossible. The hoops you have to jump through to get hold of these drugs, to comply with the regulations are so, it's like being in a Kafka play. You don't know what the rules are, they don't know what the rules are, but one thing they do know is how to make sure you never know what the rules are, so you can never get them. And this is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. It's the worst censorship of all research, not just medical research. It also applied to cannabis, by the way. You see on the top right, there was a massive increase in cannabis research when people understood that cannabis was a drug and there were cannabis receptors, etc. And again, that declined dramatically. But it came back a bit sooner, and it came back, of course, because of the decision of a whole number of American states to allow access to medical cannabis. But the psychedelics have lagged behind now. They're 20 years behind. And this is truly outrageous. And it's particularly outrageous because of the fact that psychedelics are some of the least harmful drugs known. This is now a very famous study we did comparing the harms of 20 different drugs on a very sophisticated 16-point scale of harms. And the blue bars are the harms of the drugs to the user, and the red bars are the harms of the drugs to society. And you can see that alcohol in the UK came out as top, and magic mushrooms came out as bottom, and LSD came down very low alongside mushrooms and ecstasy. Now that's been replicated by a group of European experts, 30 European experts from 20 countries. They changed every rating, they changed every weighting, and they came to exactly the same results. The only difference was that GHB changed places with ketamine. And it was more recently been replicated in Australia in 2018. So we've got 3 Western groups of experts all coming to the same conclusions. And alcohol is always number 1, and magic mushrooms are always the lowest. The ban actually led to some extraordinary convoluted thinking. In Australia, they tried to ban planting native plants in people's gardens if they contained DMT. Now, I think a large proportion of the native plants in Australia contain DMT. So the idea that you'd actually ban your own flora from people's gardens just in case someone decided to actually access the DMT. I mean, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? I mean, it really, why would you care? And why would you actually want to bring in all these non-native species? It could actually destroy your ecology. And I don't know how many of you have read Michael Pollan's latest book, Your Mind on Plants. I mean, the first chapter is remarkable. The first chapter is a chapter he wrote about 30 years ago when he was writing for Harper's, about how he was visited by the DEA because he was growing ornamental poppies. And there was a genuine attempt to try to eliminate poppy growing, even though these poppies don't make very much in the way of opium. And it's a wonderful chapter because it kind of highlights the absolute absurdity of applying drug laws without any kind of thought to what their value is. But some escaped. Amanita, interestingly, escaped. Now, I guess that's because it doesn't grow much in America. Because, since you make the laws, if you don't know what it is. I have another view, actually. It's because that's what, of course, that's how Santa was invented, and Santa now is owned by Coke, and Coke really wouldn't want to be associated with the reality of the origins of the Santa Claus myth. Ibogaine, of course, in West Africa and elsewhere. And it's not generally known, but Ibogaine is a medicine in New Zealand. It's a licensed medicine. Any country in the world where I think it's a licensed medicine. And why is that? So I was in New Zealand a few years ago, and I asked a colleague of mine, who's a sort of head of addiction research in University of Christchurch, how come you guys are so ahead of the game? And he said, it was very easy, actually, because people were using it. They were using it down in the South Island to treat heroin addiction. And the health minister rang me up one day and said, Doug, is Ibogaine a good treatment for addiction? He said, sure. And so they made it legal. Yeah, absolutely. There's some interesting anomalies. Ireland didn't realise that 5-methoxy was psychoactive, so it actually was legal in Ireland until very recently. And of course, Mexico, I think the toad scrapings always were legal. And Switzerland, any Swiss people here? Switzerland, I guess because it was, that's where Hoffman lived, and that's where the sort of psychedelic renaissance began. They've allowed both psilocybin and LSD and now and MDMA for compassionate use, and they've got a very sophisticated program of that. And that's working quite well in the sense that they were the first LSD study in anxiety disorders recently reported as an add-on in this kind of compassionate use scheme. And I think Canada now there is some access in Canada and in theory Australia, but they're fighting a very hard battle in Australia, which we are fighting against, trying to block that, but I think we will eventually win. And then there are areas where we've seen hope. Of course, we've already heard in Carey's talk about the availability of peyote for Native American churches. In the UK, we had a very interesting story. We didn't ban magic mushrooms. Occasionally we stood up to the Americans. We allowed the prescription of heroin for pain, and we didn't ban magic mushrooms until 2005, when we got a man called David Cameron. I used to say he was the worst prime minister we've ever had, but he's been succeeded by even worse ones now. And when he was leader of the Tory opposition, he started to complain that the Labour Party was soft on drugs, and Tony Blair decided to ban magic mushrooms in about 2005. But up to that point, they were legal. Of course, the Netherlands were much smarter. The Netherlands, they actually banned the mushroom, but they didn't ban the truffle. And the Dutch have had access to psilocybin truffles forever. Sad thing is, Dutch doctors never took advantage of it. So Dutch people took advantage of it, and many other people take advantage of it because they go to retreats in the Netherlands. But the Dutch psychiatrists either failed to recognise the opportunity, or I think actively avoided it, and I don't know why. No Dutch doctors in the room. It's sad because they could have actually done a lot of the pioneering work on psilocybin using the truffles. And of course now we've got several Latin American countries have legalised all indigenous plants and plant products, which kind of seems to me intuitively sense. If something grows in the ground, native in your land, why shouldn't you be allowed to pick it and use it? Other breakthroughs, of course, were Portugal, decriminalising personal possession of all drug use back in 2005. Transformational approach. Actually reduced heroin deaths or opiate deaths by 2/3 in 15 years. And in comparison in the UK, where we carried on our prohibition policies, we increased deaths by 2/3 in the same time. And of course, America did a lot better. You've tripled or quadrupled opiate deaths. And now, of course, there are very interesting developments with with Denver and Ann Arbor and Oakland, decriminalizing magic mushrooms, and Oregon. And that's, that is a fascinating decision. Let's just hope they do it right. That's all. Because if it went wrong, it could actually set us back. But currently, it's a very thrilling development. And it's obviously going to work because the Economist thinks it's a good thing. The Economist. Other signs of progress. Well, I mentioned already the fact that students are interested. We've done a bit of research. There's a couple of films that have been made about our research. That's our lead therapist, Ros Watts, when she was with us. That's our room. It was quite challenging to do that, by the way, as an aside. So that's a gene therapy room. It's not the ideal room to do psychedelic administration. So we had to every morning go in and rebuild the room to make it look like something that you would like to have a major experience in, rather than it being sterile. And we got a lot of flack for the fact that they couldn't sterilize those blinds very well. But it was hard work, but we did it. And a couple of international initiatives that I wanted to share with you. I mean, I think, potentially the bottom left one is an initiative that's to reschedule psilocybin, and it's quite an impressive group of people now. We will go to the WHO in the same way as we went to the WHO in 2018 and effectively force them to review the medical benefits of cannabis. The WHO had refused for 84 years to review the statement that they made in 1934 that cannabis had no medical value. And eventually, my charity and a couple of other charities, we forced them to do it on the grounds that, it clearly had medical value. If you've got 100 million Americans taking it for medical purposes, surely one or two of them are going to get some value. And we're going to do the same with psilocybin. That campaign will happen very soon. What is happening now, and the question is when we go. And the way you do this, by the way, is that they have an expert committee meeting every year in November, and you can go to them as a external groups, stakeholders, and you can argue with the expert groups that they should take this seriously, and then they have to persuade the WHO to take it seriously. But if you can shame the scientists on the expert panel, who are external academics, into demanding the WHO do it, and if you can offer them money to do it, because the WHO say we haven't got any money, they're happy to do reports on rare cathinones that none of you have ever heard of, but they don't want to do reports on stuff like psilocybin. But we will force them, and I'm sure within a few years the WHO will concede that it does have medical value. And then we've set up recently this organisation in Europe called PARIA, and this is a new group trying to basically educate the European Parliament. Europe is, even despite the fact that Britain's left the European Union, it's still the largest coalition of peoples in the world. It's 50, 60 million people more than the US. And you can see all the partners there. We've got a whole series of top-level European organizations relating to brain sciences, to patient advocacy, and also to cancer, which is really excellent, having the European Cancer League as part of this initiative. So we will be lobbying. We'll have a launch event in Europe probably next month. We've got a leading MEP to now become a figurehead for this, and we will be campaigning for two things. The first is to have a general acceptance that psychedelics should be considered necessary, or at least research, be part of the European research program. And we're trying to set up a separate European research theme around psychedelics. And the European research community gives out a lot of money. We could potentially get, tens of millions of euros to begin to have a European network exploring the utility of psychedelics. But it's also funded by companies as well, so the companies don't have any authority over the decision making, but they do currently underwrite some of it. And if any of you are part of organisations that aren't yet part of this, then you should see me afterwards. So that's the end of part one. Are there any questions anyone wants to make? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Have you seen any language barriers or language loopholes that have been used by countries to be able to use plants or fungi?
Yeah, well, I think the Dutch one is the best one. You know, never call it a mushroom, always call it a truffle. And then I think the native plant one that's also very compelling. I think.
Yeah, I was wondering how you suppose the role of big pharma is affecting the legalization of psychedelics, as a one-time treatment for depression is not as marketable as a pill that you have to take and take and take, coupled with the fact that the therapy required for those sessions of psychedelics is very expensive for insurance companies.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of slight misconceptions there. I mean, I think if you go back to the 60s, I think part of the undermining of LSD therapy in particular was driven by the beginnings of psychopharmacology by big pharma. LSD came along in the 50s before there were any psychiatric drugs. But by the end of the 50s, there was imipramine and amitriptyline for depression. There was chlorpromazine for schizophrenia. So psychiatry was beginning to become more like medicine, and the pharmaceutical industry, I think, was partly complicit in raising questions about whether the LSD trials, of which there were an enormous number, and there were 40,000 patients from these trials, were actually fit with the regulatory model. And the regulatory model, as you heard that Kerry was talking about, the regulatory model has never really applied to psychedelics. But currently, I think big pharma generally, they're not in the field. One or two of them are looking at the field. I think a lot of them are just grateful that someone's doing something about psychiatry, because they've all pulled out. I mean, 8 years ago, a vice president of GSK said any company that's working in the field of mental health needs their head read. And I mean, there's almost no innovation in big pharma for mental health. So I think they're kind of grateful we're doing this, and I don't think they're going to block you. And then in terms of the cost, well, we're currently doing a sort of cost analysis using health economic approach to psilocybin therapy. And yes, it's more expensive for the first 3 months, but if you look at the potential benefits over the next couple of years, it might be less expensive than daily treatment or other forms of psychotherapy that don't work so well. And it'll get even more. It'll even be less expensive if Kerry gets his way, and we all get free psilocybin from USONA. Oh, hang on, you need a.
Hi, my name is Josh from a festival called Medicine Festival. I'm really interested in your work in the UK lobbying, and I'd just be interested to know where you think the power lies. Is it in the civil service, or is it with the minds of the politicians? Where are the blockages coming through?
Minds. I think it's a bit lower down in the body, the blockage. So, the blockage is very much in the Home Office. The blockage is totally in the Home Office. A year ago, I was having discussions with scientists. There were 2 scientists in government at that time, in working in the number 10. And they were really keen on moving psychedelics, certainly psilocybin, out of Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. They were really, really keen. And it is supposedly, I'm told, that Boris Johnson, who's our sort of Prime Minister of sorts, he was in favour. And he told the Home Office to get it sorted, but they refused, and they continue to refuse. Because our Home Secretary is someone who cannot see anything other than prohibition. I mean, she wants to make the use of nitrous oxide illegal for personal use. I mean, it's utterly bonkers. So that's the problem. The problem is, in Britain, drug control is in the department that also controls the police. And as you know, if you ask a policeman what the response to anything is, it's arrest them, lock them up, and throw away the key. So we're making very good progress with that. If we change the WHO, though, we will change. It was the fact we got the WHO began to review cannabis that allowed the British government to change on cannabis, you know, because we want to be good, upstanding international citizens. Even if we know the international regulations are rubbish, we don't want to step aside from them.
You know, I'm just curious if there's anything analogous to what happened in the United States, because the fact is, cannabis is still on Schedule 1 in the United States, and the local jurisdictions said, we don't care. We're just going to create our own laws. And now they've done it, you know, intermittently with psychedelics. Is there anything like that outside of the United States that would give the opportunity? Because still, at the federal level, they're all scheduled, and we don't have banking.
Well, there's a sort of de facto decriminalisation now in the Netherlands. There's a lot of ayahuasca use in southern Spain. I think there's less, you know, prosecutions now will only occur if you actually goad the government or the police into, you know, if you challenge them up front. I don't think most people, generally realise that certainly psychedelic therapy isn't causing a great deal of social disorder or personal harm. So, but there's, you all remember what happened when the Bolivian president decided he wanted to legalize the coca leaf. And the UN ODC sent a deputation to beg with him not to do that. Why did they do that? Because they were so terrified that any change in the international regulations would blow the whole thing apart. It hasn't, interestingly. I mean, it's despicable that most Western countries actually were part of that opposition, even though they knew that the coca leaf was completely harmless. So, but you got to, laws. People like to, a lot of people like to, break in the, for some people the law is important, even if it's a bad law is still worth upholding for the principle of the law, and that is a huge challenge. And, all right. So I talked to you a bit about science now. So I've got to admit a couple of potential conflicts. So I'm working with Awaken, who are working on ketamine and MDMA for alcoholism. Compass Pathways, their trial was a direct spin-off of our trial in resistant depression, and I help a couple of other companies who are in this space. So, I mean, I don't need to tell this audience this, but I'm going to today just focus on serotonergic psychedelics, because that's where we've done almost all of our work. So, largely working with psilocybin and LSD. And I just thought it would be useful to remind you, or maybe you don't all know this, but this is one of the most salient moments in the history of medicine. So this is the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous by Bill Wilson. So he was what they called a chronic inebriate, a Yale graduate, talented guy, 15 years solid drinking, so ill. The decision was, they recommended his wife to have him locked up because he couldn't stop drinking. And then he was going through an experimental treatment at the time using a scopolamine, and he had a psychedelic experience. Suddenly the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught up in an ecstasy which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me in my mind's eye that I was on a mountain, and that a wind, not of air, but of spirit, was blowing. And then it burst upon me. I was a free man. And in the sense, his experience had broken the chains of his alcoholism. And then he went off and he founded Alcoholics Anonymous. And then in 1953, I think it was, or 54, he took LSD. And he said, hey, this is even better than scopolamine. And this is something we should be using to help what he called cynical alcoholics who couldn't see that there could be anything more than the booze, to get insights into how they might stop drinking. And his enthusiasm for LSD was actually really profound. He thought it would, he gave insights into the nature of the unconscious. He wrote to Jung, telling Jung that this was a much faster route to the unconscious than dream analysis. And he got the US government to fund 6 trials of LSD and alcoholism, 1 or 2 doses, plus abstinence-based therapy. Now, roll forward 50 years, and this is our first trial of psychedelics in depression. So 50 years, these drugs have hardly been used at all to treat major illnesses. We decided to do this based on brain imaging studies I'm going to show you in the next few slides. But so this shows the effect of a single 25 milligram dose of psilocybin on, this is the BET depression inventory. And all these patients had failed on at least 2 traditional antidepressants, some had failed on more than 10. They'd all failed on CBT. And you can see they all got better. They all got better a day after the dose. We only scored it in a week. And you see about half of them were not depressed at 1 week. This is the most powerful treatment of resistant depression ever. Nothing else, single dose, could produce that. And some of them are still well now. About, of the 20 we eventually studied in this particular program, I think 4 are still well. So you've got 8 years, and that's why it can be cost effective. If you cure someone's depression and they're well forever, then you can be cost effective. But you see the majority that begins to creep back, and even though it's still significantly less at 3 months than it was at the baseline, the depression is coming back. And that actually is currently the big challenge today, how to prevent that depression creeping back. And it tends to creep back in people who've been chronically depressed, often from childhood. Now, what we discovered in doing this research is that psychedelics changed the way people think. And this is an interesting scale we used. Before we gave them the trip, we measured their optimism-pessimism ratio. And it turns out that depressed people have what we call pessimism bias. They see the world as a nasty, hostile, unpleasant place. They're actually right, it is. But that's not helpful. I can tell all of you in this audience have what we call an optimism bias. You see the world as a lot better than it is. But that's what keeps you going, and that's what gives you energy to want to change things. And after the psilocybin treatment, they didn't become optimistic, but at least they weren't pessimistic. And here's just a quote from one of our patients. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now. It's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. Now, before I started this work, I'd never even heard of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. But I have to say that's one of my best papers I've ever been part of. It's all the narratives of the first group of patients, and it's truly impressive and moving. Here's a couple of other patients. It was like when you defragged the hard drive on your computer. I experienced things being rearranged in my mind. My mind works differently now. I ruminate much less, and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context, out of time. Now my thoughts feel like they make sense with context and logical flow. And that's a very common experience. People can actually think clearly. They realize that the depressive thinking was wrong, but they couldn't stop it. They were locked into these negative loops. So what's going on in the brain to how does psychedelics break people out of these loops? Well, a few years ago, we decided to test a theory that we developed, which is that psychedelics work in a very different way to traditional antidepressants, and that they produce different brain changes, which could explain that ability of depressed people to think differently after they'd taken a psychedelic. So this is the most recent study we published, and here we compared psilocybin 2 doses, one at the beginning, one halfway through, 2 trip doses, 2 25 milligram doses, with escitalopram. But everyone got psilocybin. So to get clinical equipoise, we told everyone they would get psilocybin, but half of them got the 2 trips, and half of them got 2 1 milligram doses, which is basically a very sub-therapeutic dose. But they all got the psychotherapy, the preparation, the psychotherapy presence, and the integration. So they all got all the surrounding therapy that goes with the psychedelic therapy. And then we monitored their outcomes over the next 6 weeks. And the psilocybin group were put on placebo, and the high-dose psilocybin group, the low-dose psilocybin group were put on escitalopram, the SSRI. If you look on the right-hand side, you see the red bars are psilocybin, the blue bars are escitalopram. And psilocybin rapidly, within 7 days, generally within a day, produces a profound reduction in depression scores. And overall, it's It's better than escitalopram. Escitalopram did extremely well. Normally SSRIs don't produce a rapid improvement in depression scores. The reason it did here was because they got a lot of psychotherapy, 3 days or 4 days of psychotherapy. Perhaps more interesting to you, this group here, is that on the left-hand side, that's the scores on the Warwick Edinburgh Wellbeing Score. And there you see psilocybin did very much better. 01, thank you. And that's good, I'm reassured now. You see the massive improvement in well-being, and that, I think, is potentially one of the key features of psychedelics. Improving well-being may well give you resilience and allow you to think more positively about the world. Now, we're not the only people. I don't want to pretend we are. The Hopkins group and the New York University group have done studies in end-of-life anxiety and depression. John Hopkins did a very interesting trial last year where they compared waiting list controls with psilocybin. You see the yellow blobs. You give people psilocybin, they get better. You keep them on the waiting list, they don't. And if you switch them over, eventually they get better. Several trials of ayahuasca. And also ongoing trials. Now we're doing halfway through our trial of anorexia. We're starting an OCD trial and a pain trial and other groups. This is a very rich area of research at present. But the question is, why would psychedelics work in these disorders? And that's because they all stimulate these 5-HT2A receptors. And these are really important critical receptors because they're highly expressed in the parts of the brain which are most recently evolved, the parts of the brain, the anterior and posterior cingulate, the prefrontal cortex, the parts of the brain which make you and us different from any other primate. That's where we encode the very high-level human experiences like planning, reasoning, imagination, etc. And they're on neurons that are deep inside the cortex. These are the so-called layer 5 neurons. This is a slice of the cortex. The layer 5 neurons are the neurons which make the brain work as a whole. You've got 100 billion neurons in your brain. Bringing all those together to make you... The human brain has more computing power than all the computers on Earth. And that's because it's got 100 billion little computers that are all linked together by these layer 5 neurons. And the layer 5 neurons are where the receptors are. You stimulate the receptors, the layer 5 neurons change activity dramatically, and that changes the way your brain works. And this was the results of the first study. We put people in the scanner, the psychedelic experienced people in the scanner, they had a full trip on psilocybin, 25 milligrams, and, or equivalent that was in those days. And we found something really bizarre. We found that actually, instead of having the brain turned on, which is what you might expect, because they had the full range of visual hallucinations and this ego disillusion, and people floated out and into space, and one met God. And when we scanned their brains, in fact, we didn't find any increase in activity. We only found decreased activity. And so we realized that Timothy Leary was wrong. Actually, these don't turn on the brain, they turn off the brain. But the turning off the brain predicts the experience. And this is another kind of imaging. This is called MEG. And this shows a powerful... If you dampen down this region at the back of the brain here, the posterior cingulate cortex, if you stop it, if you stop the rhythmic activity, normally there's a 10 hertz cycle there. If you stop that completely, your sense of your ego dissolves, because that's where your ego is encoded. And you can see this really remarkable correlation between activity in the posterior cingulate cortex. The more you switch it off, the more people have this sense of ego dissolution. I just want to show you now where the hallucinations come from. So your brain is not a camera. You don't take pictures of the world. As you probably all know, what's coming from here is going into your eyes. Your retina is then turning the photons that are reaching it into electrical impulses. The electrical impulses go into this large chunk of the back of the brain, the visual cortex, where in different parts of that put together the image that you are seeing. And the putting of that together requires probably hundreds of millions of neurons working together through those layer 5 pyramidal cells. And if we disrupt them with psilocybin, you can't reconstruct the images as you normally do, because the brain, the different regions are disconnected. And that's why you see these elemental hallucinations. And we know from electrical recording of brains that that is exactly how the early part of the visual system, the V1, V2 parts of it, reconstruct images. We know that. So for the first time, on psychedelics, you can, for the first time in your life, or since you were a baby, see the primary workings of your visual cortex. And that, to my mind, is actually one of the most remarkable discoveries we've made. And this really fits it very well with what Huxley predicted, because as you know, Huxley, when he wrote about his mescaline experience, said he went back to the writings of William Blake to explain how the doors of perception were cleansed by mescaline. And then he made this really important analysis. If mescaline opens up my mind, what's closing it? What's closing it is my brain. And he said the brain is an instrument of focusing the mind. And he was right. Why did we study depression? For two reasons. The first is that psilocybin, in common with many, many other treatments of depression, dampens down activity in this frontal part of the brain called the subgenual cingulate cortex. It's necessary to dampen that down to lift depression. But it also disrupts the default mode network. The fact that you have this disintegration of your sense of self is because your default mode, which is this region, the anterior and posterior cingulate cortices and these lateral parietal regions, that's where you encode your sense of self, and that's going to be disrupted by psilocybin in the same way as your visual system is disrupted. Why is that important for depression? Because the default mode network is overactive in depression. In fact, depression is a disorder where more of the brain is engaged in this introspective, negative thinking through the default mode. And you can see the bottom image there, the amount of rumination depressed people have is directly correlated with the activity of that system. So we thought, well, if we can disrupt the default mode and also dampen down this subgenual cingulate, maybe we would lift depression. And that's why we did the experiments, and it worked. So this is how it works in depression. Because in depression, people have constructed thought processes which are wrong. So we're moving from vision, we're moving into the sort of sense of internal construction. And what we see in normally people, when they're looking at the world, they see a very limited perspective. As William Blake said, man always sees through the chinks of his cavern. But for most of us, the chinks of the cavern, what we see is a blue sky, white clouds. But depressed people just see a black, bleak outside. And people with addiction just see their love object, the bottle or the syringe. And that's because their brain, or their mind, and then eventually their brain has locked them in to what Blake also called mind-forged manacles. And these are the manacles that chained people like Bill Wilson to alcohol. And psychedelics break these manacles because they change the way the brain works. Oops. And, sorry. And the last two slides, I just want to talk you through the sort of how that can happen. So on the left-hand side, you have a normal brain. That's called the small world brain. Your brain is so efficient as a computer because it doesn't bother to do things it doesn't need to do. Most of the brain conversations in the brain go around the edge. Visual cortex talks to visual cortex, auditory cortex, auditory cortex. Obviously, if you see a bus going to drive over you, you've got to move your legs, so you've got to have some crosstalk. But that crosstalk is very energy inefficient, so we don't do much of it. But on the right-hand side, under psilocybin, the barriers that constrain the brain are broken down, and so there's massive crosstalk. And that crosstalk has two huge implications. The first is it allows people to understand why they're depressed. Often for the first time, under the trip, they suddenly realize. One of our patients, for instance, said, I saw my father abusing me, and I was able to tell him, no, that's it. I'll never deal with that. I've dealt with it now. I've said no, I've got closure. And he came out of the trip with a much more positive view of life. But also, not only do the patients see what's caused their problem, but they can also come up with new solutions. I mean, and of course, it's extremely common that people have powerful insights into life and their meaning of life and their desires for the future under psychedelics, because your brain is much more fluid and much more creative. And a few weeks ago, we published this paper, which kind of really makes, for the first time, shows, using neuroimaging, this increased flexibility, connectivity of the brain that endures. So I showed you it during the trip. We don't scan depressed people during the trip because it would be unethical to put them in a scanner if they were having a challenging experience. But after the trip, they say they think more clearly. I showed you those commentaries. So the current way we're thinking is, you get in a disorder like depression or addiction, the brain energy landscape becomes very distorted, very steep, you get mountains and you get valleys. So people in the valleys, if you get locked into a valley of negative thinking, it's very difficult to get out of that valley. Psychedelics flatten the energy landscape. So during the trip, you have escaped from that repetitive thinking. But afterwards, the brain doesn't go back to being as contoured as before. So it's easier to move your thoughts around. If you start to slip into depressive thinking, you can get out of that valley again. And that's the image of what that this paper showed, because this paper showed, that we can actually image now increased connectivity in the brains of people who've been depressed and have recovered on psychedelics, and that increased flexibility is present at least 3 weeks after, and in fact it predicts outcomes for up to 6 months. So if you want to read any more, you can read about this little review that covers the brain science. And the other thing just to mention is that the other great thing about psychedelics, which has been discovered more recently, is that they have a plasticity benefit. So if you do learn a new way of thinking, if you get insights under psychedelics, the psychedelic itself will then help you lay down new synapses and new dendritic branches, so you can actually engage more permanently in the new insights. And this is my last slide, so you can put your arm down. Here you go. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Another great quote from the philosopher and playwright George Bernard Shaw. And what we have shown, I believe, in depression is that psilocybin changes the minds of our patients through changing their brains. And I hope that this kind of research will now give us another lever to pull to get politicians and the public. I think the public are on side, but I think we've still got to change politicians' minds and bring them back into medical practice. So I'll stop there. I'll just point out that in the last 10 years we haven't got a single penny from the British government. They've only funded the very early study they funded, and all this research has been done by donations from philanthropists. And the last study was funded by the family of this boy who killed himself in his 20s, and they gave us his legacy to do the psilocybin escitalopram trial, for which we're thankful. Thank you.
Question right here.
Thank you. Is it possible to ask two? Is that greedy? David?
Yeah. We got 15 minutes.
Okay.
I was so fast. It was rustling.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, has there been any research on the pharmacology outside of the brain and in the rest of the body?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. There obviously are 5-HT2A receptors. Certainly they're on white cells. There are some in the lungs. So people are looking at 2A agonists as possible anti-inflammatory agents, trying to suppress a white cell aggregation or activation. A little bit of work going on to see if they can be used for treatments of potentially conditions like asthma. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to ask if it's mandatory for the administrators, the therapists, after the researchers to take the psychedelics themselves at some point.
No, you can never mandate anyone to take a psychedelic. That was tried by MK Ultra. It didn't work very well. It's generally people need to have volition's quite important in the therapeutic outcomes. We think. Well, in fact, we know, because one of the ways LSD was discredited was by a particular study which was awarded the American Psychiatric Association Study of the Year, I think in 1966 or 67, when they chained people to the bed, gave them LSD and said, look, it doesn't work. That's, yes, indeed, unbelievable.
Yeah, so, you show that neuroplasticity and neurogenesis occurring with psychedelics. How does that compare to what was claimed to be going on with SSRIs in the early 2000s?
Yes, I think many treatments of depressants do increase neurogenesis. So the SSRIs, they take weeks to work. Psychedelics seem to do it, within hours of stimulating the receptor. Ketamine also does it, again, quite quickly. So there is this interesting relationship. It does seem the faster you do it, the the speed of response in terms of the mood does seem to correlate with the speed of neuroplasticity. But, and this is, I didn't have time to tell you the full story about the escitalopram comparison, but now, how long have I got? Just have a few backup slides here. No, so, what we did, there are two really interesting outputs of that last study. The first was, I showed you, that the psilocybin group have more integrated brains. The modularity, the differences between the different brain regions becomes broken down. The connectivity is enhanced. That doesn't happen with SSRIs. But as this man's an expert, by the way, in psychopharmacology. We've worked together for decades. But for the rest of you, how SSRIs work is completely different. SSRIs dampen down the limbic system. And the analogy I use is that an SSRI is to the brain what a plaster of Paris is to a broken leg. You put the leg in a plaster of Paris to keep the bone together so the bone can heal. You take an SSRI, it protects the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, against stress. Now, we know that depressed people have hyperreactive amygdalae. We can see that. You put them in a scanner. It's almost like a laboratory experiment for psychologists now. It's such a reliable finding. SSRIs dampen down that responsivity. And I think the reason they take 6, 8, 12 weeks to work is because it takes that long for the brain to heal from the chronic stressors that's called the depression. Okay, so that escitalopram psilocybin study was designed to test that theory. We predicted that the brain would be more connected after psilocybin. It was. Connections didn't change after escitalopram. And now, and we're presenting the data in Toronto on Saturday, the other side of the coin, escitalopram dampens down amygdala responsivity completely. Psilocybin, no effect. Which is why people, I think, are also more reactive and they have, they're more in tune with their emotions. They don't have the blunting affect, etc. So we've actually completely dissociated and I think now kind of proven that there are two ways you can live depression.
We've got another question right here.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your humor today. It's been wonderful. There's a lot of research at the moment going into neuroplasticogens, and they're kind of trying to engineer out the psychedelic experience. Yeah. How important to you is the psychedelic experience in solving and treating mental illness?
Well, I think you've gathered from my talk, I think it's pretty important. I have our patients generally say it was an interesting, challenging, but necessary experience. I mean, why you would want to get rid of it, I don't know. I mean, I think I understand that maybe there are some people that wouldn't want it. Would a neuroplastogen work as well as a psychedelic plastogen? I very much doubt it. So, I mean, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, there are companies that have been set up to make analogues of psilocybin, of DMT and LSD, which supposedly aren't psychedelic. We don't even know that. I mean, they just don't cause a head twitch in a mouse, which is not necessarily a perfect proxy for the human experience. And it may be when they get into humans, they will be psychedelic, time will tell. But if they're just neuroplastic, I think it's unlikely that a single dose of a neuroplastic agent is going to suddenly change the way you think about the world. And if they work at all, I suspect they're going to have to be used chronically in the same way as SSRIs are used chronically.
Every day for the rest of their
Well, it might well be that, exactly. It might be, I think some of them, the US Defense Department has given $29 million to Brian Roth to find something that you can use to treat the military veterans without giving them a trip. I mean, I think it's all part of the fact that currently, under current, US law, if you made a psychedelic, it will be illegal. And so, they basically would like to rather than change the law, they want to kind of bypass the law. But time will tell. I mean, it's at least that's been done, and in a few years we'll know.
One more over here real quick.
Do you know of any research regarding adding hericium compounds with psychedelic therapy?
Any what?
Like lion's mane hericium compounds? No.
I don't suppose anyone's done it, have they? I mean, individually you might have done, I guess, but you can tell us if it works. But no one's. I'm sure no one's doing any research on it. Well, if anyone is, I guess he's here. Are you? Damn it! He's not doing it. That's fine. When he raises some money, he will, though, I'm sure.
There are 5 clinical studies on lion's mane. We populated a website called mushroomreferences.com. It's just for researchers, and it's non-branded. So if you go there, there's 5 clinical studies. All of them are small. The most recent one with Alzheimer's and lion's mane is the lion's mane mycelium, not the fruit body. And if you go to mushroomreferences.com, I populate a website for researchers and physicians. So please check that out. All those studies are in there, and once a month I'm a victim of Google Scholar alerts. And now as they've become so robust, I'm losing control of them. But that's a great resource. There's a lot of great evidence. There's one clinical study right now with Alzheimer's and lion's mane mycelium that should be coming out next year that's showing tremendously positive results. So there's 5 independent studies and a 6th one currently ongoing.
Hi, David. Question, we were talking yesterday about the different hemispheres of the brain.
Yes.
And how they interpret the world very differently. Yeah. When you've been doing the studies on psilocybin, do you see one hemisphere reacting more than the other, or are they both reacting in the same way?
Yeah, the disruption of rigidity in the brain, it seems occurs right across the brain. And I think so, but I think what that means is that for the first time, probably in most people's lifetimes, the left hemisphere, or the dominant hemisphere, is no longer dominant. And that actually fits with something fascinating we found we've had quite a few of our volunteers have turned out to be colorblind. And they see colours much more vividly and interestingly after. And I think that's part of the fact that basically we download colour vision to the less important part of the brain because we're so fascinated by language. I mean, language is, really, it does mess with most of our minds most of the time. And if you break that down, you can actually then liberate all those right hemisphere processes, which are normally rather, seen as rather sort of primitive and primeval. They come back to the fore for a bit. I think there was a question from our leader here.
Actually, I had a couple of probably trivial questions, but one thing I was wondering, when you refer to Bill Wilson's psychedelic experience that led him to found Alcoholics Anonymous, how could that have happened in 1933 when LSD was not invented until 1938 or something? Did he invent time travel, or is that just a mistake? Or
well, no,
what
it's
was the
interesting.
date on that?
I think you're going to get a question. I think there's someone in the audience here who knows a little bit about hyoscine, doesn't he, and scopolamine. I think he's going to talk about that. This is the Chinese psychedelic. Yeah, so you'll hear about that. Is that tomorrow? No, in 2 hours' time. Wait, hang on for it. So it was almost certainly an anti-cholinergic scopolamine.
It was scopolamine, not exactly a psychedelic. Then.
No, but it was still a profound experience that
Right.
changed his mind.
Right.
And I don't know. Have you all read Oliver Sacks's book about his experiences? Yes. Well,
Yes.
Scopolamine is pretty powerful, at least in his brain.
My other question was maybe kind of irrelevant, but I wonder, I recall you were talking about how the British government has funded no psychedelic research. The American government is pretty much the same. They're beginning to reluctantly fund a little research. And I recall a conversation I had with Roland Griffiths about a study that came out at some point that showed that people who take psychedelics tend to have a more liberal mindset, or become, they tend to develop a more liberal worldview, since most politicians are really biased toward conservative worldviews. He was terrified that if this information got out, the government would shut down psychedelics completely. On the other hand, the possibility that you could persuade some politicians to take psilocybin might make them more amenable to funding this kind of research.
Yeah, well, we don't exclude politicians from our studies, as far as I know.
They just don't fund, they just don't apply for the study.
I'll tell you, but we did actually have one very liberal MP in our MDMA study. The answer is that most politicians don't want to even countenance the thought that they might change their thoughts. Because they know they're right. As soon as you get elected, you have a divine authority to adjudicate anything.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Has there been any specific research with dementia and psychedelics?
Well, there's been a bit of research. There was some of my team were working with a company who were doing a sort of MIDI dosing LSD study at Northwick Park Hospital a few years ago, looking at age-related memory impairment. I think they were doing, I think it might have been a 25 microgram dose, I can't remember exactly. And it was twice a week, I think, for like 6 weeks. And I asked them afterwards, and they said, did it affect cognition at all? They said, no, it didn't affect the cognition, but people were happier. And I said, how do you know that? They said, because they were singing to each other more. So I think you might improve mood, but I'm not whether you can actually improve cognition. I think maybe you have to go on a lot more. I don't know. It's a hot area, It might be that if you... I mean, I always give the anecdote. Hoffman lived to 101, and he took LSD regularly, often MIDI doses. The first British psychiatrist to take LSD was Joe Elkes. He was professor of experimental psychiatry. Those were the days. We don't even have psychiatry professors, let alone experimental psychiatry professors anymore. He came to America, set up the ACNP. He lived to 103. So the idea that it does fry your brain, I think, is probably a bit overstated by the CIA.
We're talking about depression a lot, and let's say we jump in time and psilocybin's legal for treatment openly. How do you see a depressed patient use psilocybin? What would be the treatment that you would vision today for depression?
I'd envision doing what we did, which is have probably 2 therapy sessions with a trained therapist, guides, integration therapist afterwards.
And the dose?
Well, 25 milligrams seems very well tolerated, so I don't see any reason to go. I don't think we get ethics to go above that without spending hundreds of thousands of pounds doing pilot work. So I think that's a reasonable dose. I think the really interesting question is how to prolong the effects, and there's loads of options. I mean, there's you could potentially microdose them forever, or you could give them a dose every 3 months, or you could put them on SSRI, or there's all sorts of, or you could just have intensive psychotherapy. There's all sorts of ways you could prolong it. That's the real challenge to me. How, particularly the people who've been chronically depressed, often from childhood, where they can escape from it for maybe for weeks or months, but then it comes back. And I mean, depression is an evil disorder because your brain is forcing something on you that you don't want and you know you don't deserve. And of course, it's even worse when it becomes so clever that it makes you think you do deserve it. And that's, of course, when people kill themselves.
Thank you so much, David. We're going to have to wrap it up.